Okay, Cara, let's head into it. All right, cool.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon, we're heading into our third workshop on the long-term plan, and it's focused around a discussion about your appetite for growth. This follows on from discussions at the second workshop. So, to expand on that, the purpose of today is to agree the scope and direction of the long-term plan through your discussion about your appetite for growth in the context of the wider environment as we know it so far. And today we'll complete the initial scope and direction conversations. These are conversations that will provide detail needed for budgeting and reviews of strategies and policies in the long-term plan. It lays the groundwork for the detailed discussions, the really meaty bits that will follow over the next few months. So where we need to get to today, using a discussion about your appetite for growth, we seek your direction on population forecasts. Which one should we be using for our budgets and activity management planning? That work is underway now, and so that will be timely and very helpful for that. With the SSP's review, would you like to keep any non-mandatory ones at this stage? We'll come back to this. We'll be doing further work and coming back to you with alternative approaches. We'll share information that we've got about the impact on development contributions on whether you have a 10 or 20 year time frame, and we seek your direction on that as well. That will also impact and assist the budget and activity management planning. And your appetite for changes to fees and charges. So to assist your discussion, we wanted to come back and help provide some of the context for that. So touching on the wider environment, we've broken it down to local, nationwide and global. Looking at a local level, we have continued population and household growth. There are cost of living pressures within our community across the whole nation. Employment opportunities. Where could there be more? What opportunities are there? We're aware that there are labour shortages, particularly in builders, which has an impact for household growth. And O2L, there are opportunities and impacts for our connectivity, impacts for our town centres here in Levin and Foxton as we work towards the O2L coming into being and then from that time onwards. Nationwide, these are some of the areas of uncertainty. We've got the Three Waters reform, resource management reform, and future for local government in the environment around us. We have the central government election on the 14th of October. And also, an additional point to add there is that census figures will be coming out from about May next year, so quite late in our process. Globally, the movement of people is rebounding and growing. There's movement of people to New Zealand, from New Zealand to Australia, and our tourism is rebounding as well. Before we move to the next slide, is there anything key that you think that we've missed from that slide there in the environment around us? We'll be providing you with more detail, more local figures over the next week or two to help give you that local picture.
Just on that one, probably the just opportunities in Shannon as well.
I guess anything I was going to mention would be like government policy, but you've probably covered it in central government election. I presume that's what you're sort of referring to. Yeah.
I haven't formulated my question probably good enough yet, but I'm just wondering if there's something missing in the local space around the production aspect of our district as well. We talk a lot about food. We've got the household growth, employment opportunities, labour shortage. I just wonder if we still need to recognise that production environment that we have.
And then we come back to population forecast that we started discussing last week. So what we have here is all of the information on a page. We've got the Census Partners 2020 figures that we used for the 2021 long-term plan. Beneath it, the 2023 update sits and shows how those numbers have been pulled back slightly. What we see, and when we're looking at Census Partners 2023, the variation, say looking from 2029, working from the 25th percentile across to the highest 95th, is about 2,500 people difference, working from the low to high range. You also see from the 95th percentile in 2020 and 23 how those numbers have been pulled back as well. So 2029 was previously estimated to be almost 45,000, now estimated to be almost 42,000. So that's there as a reference for you with your discussions. It includes, to touch on the other parts, the Infometrics forecast, which is the alternative one that we have received from the Manawatu Wanganui grouping of councils, Census Partners being with the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee grouping of councils. The growth rates in the top right corner, and the population growth that we have seen is provided by Stats NZ. Between 2018 and now. So I'll leave that as. Are there any questions on that one?
Cara, it's interesting that a lot of them are talking about that, that they expect things to slow down after 2030, that they expect, even Census Partners is against that, though. It's saying their growth is going to be greater after 2030, whereas I think Infometrics actually say it's going to be slightly less. So I just, there's a little bit of correlation there. The other thing I'd like the table to understand the context of what these population growth figures mean in determining some of the LTP decisions that we make. And, the unintended consequences, if you like, of saying, what does the 95th percentile mean as against the 50th percentile mean? And Jacinda may have to chime in with, the impact that has on revenue, development contributions, whatever, because I think there's a wider need of understanding in terms of, it's easy to say, let's pick 1.5, but what does that actually mean in terms of those long-term plan decisions? Is that a fair question?
It does have lots of implications in terms of, you're right, in terms of the revenue we receive, the growth we expect in the district each year in terms of the offset to rates, in terms of how many properties will help to absorb the extra rates. But as well, if it becomes a significant difference, it's around that infrastructure investment or other investment that we plan to make to provide for that growth. And the decision around if there's a significant difference between what we've been planning for and where we might like to sit now, then that would cause some significant changes in terms of the capital side as well, potentially.
Bernie looks like he's still got a question.
No, I'm not yet trying to formulate this. Just to, I'm still filling up in my mind. My concern is, I suppose, is that especially new councillors won't understand the ramifications of deciding what our growth figure should be in terms of the impact that that does have on our revenue expectations, especially, then how that informs our rates decisions, all those sorts of things. I just think at some stage we need a wider conversation in terms of understanding what those impacts are.
I have a similar question, and thanks for the email the other day. It really sparked my thinking about this idea of growth, and population is such a blunt tool for us, and it's not our core business either. Our core business is collecting rates, and so in some ways we need to define growth by the number of properties, whatever we rate our district on. And so, do we need to start thinking of growth in terms of numbers of properties, numbers of houses, new houses, and things like that we're expecting in this district? What's happened in the past? Have we seen sort of subdivisions in semi-rural areas or rural areas pop up rather than urban areas? And in some ways, those figures and having some of the indications around the types of housing and properties that have popped up in our region over the last few years might guide our thinking going forward the next 20 years as well. Does that make sense? You guys are the experts on this. Because I think we need to link it into what is our core business, and it's collecting rates, essentially.
And the question for me is about, following on from Bernie's question, is about underestimating versus overestimating the risks associated with each. And it just feels to me like the greatest risk would lie with underestimating rather than overestimating. But I'm just interested if that makes sense, of the two options. Who answers that?
I think I sit on your side of the fence on that, and that I think the risk is with the underestimating. The LTP we get to every 3 years typically, so that is typically when you get to recast things, and we'll show you some. We're not asking you right at this minute to make the decision. There's a few more slides which will hopefully paint a bit more of a picture. And I think when you start looking at it in that 3 year period, what's the difference over a 3 year period? Yes, you've planned out for longer, but in terms of the actual impact of the variance and things like that, I think it ends up being quite small between the percentiles. So Jacinta's right, there's a whole lot of implications, but my assessment of the risk there would be you'd feel that greater if you're stuck on a projection now we weren't allowed to touch it for 20 years, because then you could have a massive difference. But the reality is the council around this table is going to look at this in 3 years' time and say, okay, they chose there, were they right, wrong, how far were they wrong? And, we come to very much like what we're asking you to do today, in terms of, like we covered the last workshop, where I sort of painted the picture about what had happened previously and how we tracked against that and things like that. So happy for any of my colleagues in the back row to sort of provide a perspective if they have a different view in terms of whether there's a greater risk. I've sat on the side of underestimating, but if someone wanted to provide a balance to that view and sort of argue for maybe there's a greater risk with the overestimating, and it'd be good to hear that. Monique's going to jump in.
Just one of the things worth thinking about is if you go back to that earlier slide that Caro put up around the environmental context, and come the 14th of October, there's a range of new policies that are currently being floated by a number of government potential parties that may become government. One of them actually provides financial incentive to councils for every building consent that they grant that is above their baseline. And so I think there is, we don't have enough information about that yet, but there is, if we overstate and that was to become a policy, that could potentially limit councils' ability to attract financial an offset of some form of financial grant from the government to help fund growth. I think the other the biggest challenge around overstating growth is that when you come to then set your rates every year, if we've assumed growth at a particular level, but it's slower than that, then our rates forecast won't be able to be subsidised to the level that we might have assumed within our long-term plan, which then puts the pressure back on the ratepayer because we've still built the infrastructure, we've still done the work.
Can I just very quick question in terms of the last slide with the population there? So obviously we sat around based on the 2018 census. I presume it was around the 37,000 population wise. Have we had any indication yet? Acknowledging it's just been another census, but is there any indication through any other metrics of what that figure looks like now? Or is that might be coming on?
So the 2018 census figure that they had is the 33,001, and their June 2023 estimate is the 37,501. So that's the latest that we have from them. I've added in here the June 2023 migration data from Stats NZ as well. And what it shows, so it's broken into two parts, New Zealand citizens and non-New Zealand citizens, arrivals, departures and net migration. So it shows that within the categories, arrivals from New Zealand citizens is it's nearing what it was pre-COVID and say the 2015s, 2016, 17s. Departures is higher than it was in the pre-COVID years. For non-New Zealand citizens, arrivals are considerably ahead of where they were pre-COVID. Departures are also significantly ahead, and what that shows in that final long column, the mean estimate, is that there are more people coming than there were in years before COVID. And so the reason for including this is with the population forecasts, and particularly with the Infometrics forecast, they were predicting migration to return to pre-COVID levels at a much slower rate. And what we're actually seeing is that returning at a higher rate. So, a bit of context there. I've touched on part of this, the last two points, but following on from the note we circulated, what our neighbours are doing, Kapiti is staying with the same bed that they used previously at the 50th percentile, a 1.1% growth rate. And just reflecting back on where our ones are under Sense Partners, it's 1.3 to 1.5. Infometrics 1.3%. So ours is at a higher rate in those first 10 years. Palmerston North are taking a hybrid view using Infometrics data as well as Stats New Zealand data, adapting their approach given that international migration has picked up at a faster rate than forecast by Infometrics. Good. Right. Is everybody happy if we move? Sure.
The household growth rate that Palmerston gives, that's the number of houses, new houses, is it? Or
Households, the standard definition is occupied houses. So yes, interesting to note there that they use a different population one to their household one. In the past, we've typically run the same, so it might be something to consider. So to help to help the conversation, I thought it might be useful just to put some numbers to give you that sense. And I guess part of the picture I'm trying to paint here is, the differences, what it actually means. So I've used the sense partners because that's what we've used for previous LTP. We'll ask you later on tonight whether or not you want to keep our sense partners, but so it feels a bit like apples and apples. If we take the 50th percentile over the next 20 years, then that is an average of 418 extra people a year. So over the 20-year period, 8,364, which is nearly doubled by the time you get to the 95th percentile, like 25 people per year on average. When you look at it in 3-year totals, then there's basically a difference of 1,200 people in the district in terms of what that might mean for people over that period of time. We last week spoke about the dwelling units and obviously looking at that through.
So can I just go back to the last one? Yeah, the previous earlier slide was in percentage terms of growth, say 1.2 to 1.5. Do you have an idea of where that sits on the 50th, 75th, 95th percentile?
Yes.
Yeah. So the 95th percentile for 20. Let's just I'll flash back to here. So it sees we've just got it for 75th and 95th at the moment, but sense partners it's 1.3 at 75th percentile, 1.5.
Oh, okay, right.
So there, and
Yep.
there's obviously
Okay.
be another
Thanks.
a lower number for
Yep.
50th.
Cheers.
So last presentation I spoke about the. Oh, sorry, Jordan.
Just going to go back to the last slide.
That one.
Yeah, I mean, being new to this whole process, is our growth, is past growth being constant like that, or is it just lumpy? You know, there's all of a sudden subdivision, we get massive growth one year and then nothing for the next 3 years. And how do we, if that's the case, how do we plan for that or provide some? I always hate people that use stats and averages.
Yeah, and look, the picture we painted the previous presentation, tried to get across that we'd sat at 30,000 for the district for about 25 years. 1 year, the highlight of the newspaper was that we're growing by 10 people. That's how static we were. What's happened since then? So 2012, the council had a average growth rate of 0.1%. 2015, we went to the assumption of 0.4%. 2018, we went with 1.2%, and 2021 it was 2.1%, I think. No, it doesn't always just follow a nice line like that. But we have limited ways of tracking it because we get these, and from a population point of view, we get a census and everything in between. It's a bit fuzzy. One thing we can track has been the dwelling units, the new houses. And so what was interesting, the next slide is, I'll sort of use the next slide to speak to and then can come back to your question if there's still more to be answered, was that that left-hand column there was what the LTP in 2021 forecast for the number of new dwellings to. If we were to track along that 95th percentile line, in terms of where it starts and where it was tracking over those 3 years, those were the number of new dwellings that we needed to do. And you'll even see from there just 265 to 352, 341, some of that modelling isn't exactly a smooth line. It has some little ups and downs, and only the mathematicians probably can explain that better. Certainly they can explain it, I can't. But what we saw is over that 3-year period, 958 was the number of new dwelling units that we needed to consent if we were to stay on track with the 95th percentile. And over that period, we actually 985. So we tracked above that 95th percentile. But as you'll see, obviously, no, we didn't go up incrementally. We had a good year, then that even better year, then it's dropped down. And that's typically what's sort of happened with that and sometimes that will be influenced by the developments that come in. But there's obviously a range of things. The population bit's always a bit of a lag to what you sometimes see happen on the ground, that people do subdivisions, do houses, people will come after the house is consented, essentially. So I don't know if there's an alternative way to than what we're obviously putting forward. I appreciate you might dislike the way it's talked about in terms of average growth and obviously, but ultimately we need to sort of land somewhere in terms of saying, well, what do we think the population is going to be by a particular date, because that's going to drive a range of things, and similarly with our household.
Well, it looks like your numbers line up there, but is that a happy coincidence? I mean, does population really correlate to new dwellings that accurately that you presented there? Or do we just focus on new dwellings rather than taking a population number? What were some of the numbers previously? 325 houses, and I think 1 year it was only 500 odd people, was it?
This is previous 3 years.
Just remember to use your microphones, guys, because people are watching us on YouTube.
So I tried to get across last time that it's certainly not an exact science. That the thing with forecasts and projections is, they're going to be wrong. It's more often a case of how wrong they're by. But what we, and you might be right, yep, happy coincidence that we've just been able to track along that. Certainly some of the information that we give to the people doing this work, they do get to a sort of a granular level of detail where they're sort of trying to look at what is happening. They do tend to look back, but obviously try and understand sort of what it is that we've done in terms of zoning land and making land available and that sort of thing as well, to try sort of paint a bit of a picture.
Well, that's another big issue, isn't it? Around, I mean, in some ways the council controls the number of new dwellings by how quickly it can make land available and provide consents and the other process required to build it, isn't it? So, in some ways, you could probably say, well, we can project this, but actually we can control the situation as well.
So my comment to understand the sport, that's when are we expecting Tararika to start drip feeding houses in, and how many houses in a year can they deliver? Do we?
You're right in that Tararika is certainly one of the areas we are expecting to accommodate a lot of the growth. At the moment, we've got obviously the majority landowner being the one that's started in that space. The first proposal application for 200 plus lots is in. So if that continues to go smoothly, you'd expect that's going to obviously contribute 200 houses at a point. But there's other landowners and hopefully in time other developers that start to bring developments online as well. So it's not just reliant on one family or one company doing it.
Just on this one, David, in terms of dwelling units consented, do we have any anecdotal evidence yet, or any evidence yet of the effect of government policy on building? And by that I mean the cost of building, given new MB rules, etc. Is there any sort of flow-on effects of that as yet we're aware of, or is it?
I think I tried to defer this to Mr. Spencer last time just to see if there's any, because it is, we'll have to probably be anecdotal. We've seen a slowing, obviously, the consents come through, but it feels that's more market forces than probably government policy. But Mr. Spencer might want to answer that.
No, I think it probably covers it, David. I think it's probably too early to tell. But it looks like sort of macroeconomic factors dragging it down at the moment in terms of demand. I don't think there's any clear evidence that I've heard or seen that suggests that what government's imposed around H1 standards or liquefaction has had an impact. I mean, obviously increasing the cost of doing stuff, but I don't have any linkage to any demand numbers this time.
So just make a mental note of those numbers 325, 394, 266. As I move on to the next slide. So this slide and the next slide. So household growth, as mentioned earlier, household, when they do it statistically, that's talking about occupied households, occupied houses. And so using those Sense Partners figures, that's what the projections show. Now to get to the dwelling units, or to actually get to what's called the dwelling count of the district, then you need to take both the occupied households plus the unoccupied ones, so things like holiday homes and places that people might not live in on the night of the census. And so we, in our previous long-term plan, assumed an occupancy in our district of 90%. So said, okay, well, if 90% of the houses are occupied, how many? So an extra basically 10% on top of the households. So in terms of actual dwelling units, in terms of if we were to run with this scenario using sense partners and picked one of these percentiles, those would be the number of new dwelling units that we'd be looking to see consented as they come through the process over that period. And again, I've just put the 3-year totals down the bottom there to help with, I guess, just that sense of, if we got this wildly wrong, say we went to the 50th percentile and we actually tracked at the 95th, that would be the difference, or vice versa, say we went with the 95th and actually things were much slower, just so you can see the magnitude of difference when you look at that over a 3-year period. Yes, I get that you've obviously planned a long-term plan for much longer, but in terms of when you possibly come back to this as a council, you're obviously entitled to come back to it earlier, but typically it would be a 3 years that you come back and have another look, were we right, were we on track or not. And so again, just trying to give you a sense of the magnitude that you're perhaps looking at there. And so before you answer the question around what set of projections and what percentile, there was a challenge put out by a councillor at the previous workshop around this desire to have a conversation around the appetite for growth. And it's a bit unfortunate he's not able to be here, and he was able to provide some commentary though. But my framing, or my memory from how he framed it last time was, there's a spectrum between sort of being a council that perhaps accepts growth happens and doesn't do too much about it, or versus maybe a growth hungry council. And so, as part of, I guess, seeking your thoughts on what is the appetite of this council towards growth, encouraging you to think about what might be the difference between those two ends of the spectrum, and probably jumping a little bit to some of the conversations that were just had a moment or two ago. What would council do differently if you were at either end of those spectrums? What is it that council can actually influence, and what is out of council's control when it comes to growth? In my efforts to prepare for this presentation, I actually found myself Googling, can council stop growth, and various other things like that, just to see if anything would interesting pop up, or to try and get some headlines where councils were actually trying to actively stop growth or be anti-growth. What tools did they actually use to do that? We know there's some levers they can pull to maybe enable it, but my sort of sense is that there's growth happens, and there's somewhat limited to actually being able to stop it completely. And then just encouraging you to think about, and this is probably where the Mayor's comments come in earlier, around what impact could this have for the approach that council has as it prepares this LTP. And so I had a small go at just trying to, I guess, put my perspective, if I think, and try to sort of think about those two ends of the spectrum, what might be some of the things that I think a council would possibly be doing. If it was a growth happens council, then maybe they're only providing very limited advanced lead infrastructure. They're only doing the bare minimum sort of requirements and providing zoned land. So government direction requires us to have an oversupply of a certain percentage. But so a growth happens council probably is only just meeting that. Probably not being too specific about where the growth happens. So just allowing the location to be market driven, and council being more reactive than proactive. So development would happen, and then growth. Council would then start to make sort of decisions around, if growth has happened, what do we then need to do next? And it would probably be a council that had minimal controls around design requirements, so it wouldn't be too phased around the outcomes that were being achieved from that. Jumping to the other end of the spectrum, I thought maybe a growth hungry council would be one that would be proactive. They would certainly be aware of the growth, thinking about the growth, and be at the sort of forefronts of their minds. There'd be multiple opportunities enabled in different locations through zoning and infrastructure. There'd potentially even be incentives provided to encourage development, active promotion, facilitation, and enabling opportunities. And there'd probably be some controls in there used to actually maximise the yields that are achieved or the outcomes. So I thought, well, if those are two ends of the spectrum, I better perhaps have a look at something that sits maybe in the middle. And so thought, I've called it balanced growth, just sort of sitting in the middle. But I looked up smart growth as well and thought maybe that takes us down a different path. So balanced growth I saw as being accounts that's proactive in planning where growth can occur and the type of growth appropriate for the location. So it's aware of what it wants to protect, it's aware of the type of growth that it wants to encourage. It takes a staged approach to development of growth areas to ensure infrastructure is ready. So it's probably a little bit less. There is maybe some lead infrastructure, but it's recognising there's a bit of a staged approach. So it's probably provided closer to the time than maybe well in advance. There could be some incentives to encourage specific types of development. So that might be particular types of housing or that maybe the market isn't generally going to provide without encouragement. There'll be opportunities promoted and there'll be some controls in place to manage yields and growth outcomes. Those probably all need to be considered in line of the think piece thinking. That it's those are my opinions and thoughts, and you'll have your own. But hopefully, between those three, maybe it's prompted a few thoughts, and you'll be able to add to those a little bit as well. And so, in a moment, I'll turn this over to you. But I have got 5 prizes in front of me here, and I'm just going to engage you here in a little exercise. And I've just snipped out a few statements that other places have when they talk about their growth. And just have a bit of a read. I've obviously deliberately sort of left out the locations, but there's a prize if you can name where that place is or who that might be referring to. That slide all relates to one place. So it's how one place when council was essentially describing their approach to growth. Anyone brave enough to have a guess? Company? No.
Palmerston North.
No. Take a third guess. Otherwise, it looks like Kara's getting a chocolate.
I like this game.
All right, because there's a couple more of these. That one's Cambridge. All right. Number 2. What about this one? Yep. We'll give Jonathan that one. Selwyn. Bit shorter this one. Not quite right. Right part of the country, almost. Yes, very good. That's just catching skills like. All right, what about this one? Not Auckland. I don't know what sucked you into that one. Geographically, you're very close, Bernie. Oh, halfway between. Kapiti is correct. Kapiti, was that one? No? Oh, no. Very good. All right, you might recognise this one. It's actually Whangarei. Yeah. So I guess the point I make is that I'm conscious that there was an appetite or expressed the desire maybe to have some statements that really pushed and focused what is Council's appetite and approach to growth. And for those of you who got a chance to read Councillor Jennings' email this morning, you'll see he sort of asked this question around, should we be targeting or accepting growth? Is there a difference between saying that by 2043 we want to be a district of X population or people, or perhaps what we do at the moment where we say by 2043 we expect to have a population of X? I think we'll have a long-term plan that references population, so it won't be the only thing. We can talk about houses and things as well, but I'm sure we will include population in there. So at this point, pretty happy to turn it over to you as a table in terms of the request was made to have a conversation around what is the council's growth appetite. If you haven't got enough information to have that, what is it that you need to perhaps land or be able to say that? Is this a conversation you do feel is important to the LTP? A little bit later we're having it in this order because a little bit later we are going to ask you, where are you sitting in terms of those population projections? But obviously understanding where your appetite is might influence that as well. So open to comments and thoughts.
I'll kick it off. Do you want to go back to your slide with balanced growth? Is that a good reference point to have a discussion from? I mean, I missed all Sam's discussion at the last workshop and only briefly read his email. But from the email that you sent out earlier in the week, for me, there's a bit more of an esoteric sort of academic approach to that first point there, council proactive and planning where growth can occur and the type of growth appropriate for the location. In some ways, in a 20-year plan, it'd be nice to sort of set down a bit more of a vision around what we want this district to look like with respect to growth. Do we want a whole lot of little urban areas popping up all over the place, or do we want some sort of balance between urban and semi-rural areas, and how do we balance the rural areas out as well? For me, understanding that the spatial elements of our district from a landscape, land use, is probably more important than just saying, right, we're going to plan for growth. Can we plan for those spatial elements going forward as well? And will we have to do that in the future with any new RMA reforms as well, come up with spatial plans on what our areas have to look like as well? There's a whole lot of questions that are poorly formulated, sorry.
Yeah, so I think probably the comment I would make is that clearly this conversation doesn't sit in isolation. The council does have a growth strategy, adopted growth strategy at the moment. Yes, there are, again, the last council meeting talked about a process which this council is going to be part of in terms of a future development strategy, along with as part of our work with the Wellington Regional Leadership Group. And yes, you're right, RMA reform does paint a picture of going down the route of sort of regional strategic planning as well. So we do, I guess, have some markers in the ground already in terms of our growth strategy, which talks about some of what you've described about where and how we want to grow, that sort of spatial component. It doesn't necessarily maybe not go down to exact some of the detail that you described around the sort of the types of houses, the types of people and things that we might want here, for instance. But the LTP does, obviously, at the moment we're saying sort of growth is potentially one of our three big topics that we're going to be talking about. And so I think it is important to sort of be able to formulate a view in terms of what, when we say growth, what is our approach to growth.
Could I have a look at the hungry one? Just a couple of thoughts, not particularly deep, fairly shallow, but important. The first is that I think that Jonathan's absolutely right in terms of what we want our district to look like, that rural-urban feel. The growth strategy gave me some reassurance around that, and the way that that will feed into the district plan when it actually then becomes law is really important in any discussion. When I think about our people here at the moment, there are some really big gaps in terms of the skilled workforce, in terms of the younger workforce and those things. And the acknowledgement of that, you talk to the professionals in our district and so on, they cannot get the skilled people. And those sorts of considerations lead me more towards the growth hungry idea, because I can see the opportunities given the natural move north anyway. It's going to happen, so why not be hungry for it and really try to embrace a much richer population with a richer workforce that follows and so on. So I tend to be much more on the proactive end of the scale rather than the status quo or even, the balanced. So just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, David, I tend to agree. I think back to last term and probably the one before that, when these discussions started happening around, when we realised that growth was a real thing for us and had never been before, and certainly to that extent. And with growth, it came with aspiration and opportunity, which was often spoken to by those councils, the last council particularly, when we settled on that. And then we went sort of searching for it, no doubt, with Talega, with that opportunity to present to us. We were growth hungry, and we've seen a lot of certainly our financial assumptions around that. So I see us certainly somewhere between balanced and growth, if not, balanced and hungry, if not quite a hungry, but I think we're somewhere close to it. And I see nothing, personally, that's changed that. Sure, there's a slowdown at the moment, but that's the environment we're currently in. And there's no evidence to say that growth won't continue to the extent it is, given that we now know that O2NL is happening. There's no doubt it's now happening, and that was the catalyst, we know, for a lot of the growth we were seeing already. So so that's where I see it.
Yeah, and just for me, I'm probably sitting with Deputy Mayor as well. Look at these numbers here, especially when you sort of look between the 75 and 95 percentile, and then you look at your last slide, which is sort of talking at 2040. I'd sort of see us in the late sort of 40s or just hitting that 50 mark from where I would see it at that sort of growth rate. I think, you look at sort of 2029, especially on the back of O2NL, and I see massive opportunity. And even look at the likes of Foxton, Shannon, Tokomaru being sort of an exit point, whether you're going up State Highway 1 or 2. There's actually a massive opportunity, and then obviously Levin would be its own sort of destination, if you like. So that's probably sort of my thinking. But I'd quite like to see us sort of focus more probably around that aspect anyway.
I'm going to jump in here again. I haven't really given these three topics much thought because they'd only just been presented to us, I suppose. And I was wondering what those terms used in the email meant. But we can be growth hungry, but we have to be careful on how that's managed and planned out. We just don't want to be a service centre for Wellington and a dumping ground for low income, cheap housing as well. I mean, even if we are thinking of talking about rates and land values and house values, if we go to the capital-based rating value next time that discussion comes up, and we've gone for the growth hungry approach and developed a whole lot of cookie cutter cheap houses with oodles of cul-de-sacs, our role as council is going to be in a no better position. Essentially, we're not getting enough income to service the town and population that's coming in anyway. So we have to be very careful of how that growth hungry rolls out. There has to be a lot of controls, I think, around what it looks like going forward in the future. I mean, that's just thinking off the cuff, off the top of my head.
I'll have you on. In terms of your subsequent slides with all the pretty wording, none of it really matters, and I don't care about Sam's statement of if we should be aiming for. I mean, I disagree with him, but that doesn't actually affect terribly much how we write a pretty statement about our growth. In terms of growth hungry versus growth happens, growth will happen regardless. Are our residents growth hungry? If you go out and ask a bunch of those people, do they want their town to grow? Yeah. Council is growth hungry. We want more money to build better things. Great. But yeah, that shouldn't be us subsidising development off the back of our existing residents. So I'm fine with a number of those bullet points, but yeah, incentives provided to encourage development, to me, doesn't sit right. When we flip to the balance tab, when we say we'll incentivise specific development, i.e. social housing, yeah, that's great. That's what we're already doing. Fine with that. 75th percentile would be my kind of inkling. But yeah, a lot of this discussion and time we're spending here is, as much as it matters, it doesn't matter particularly much.
I tend to agree with Rogan, actually. This is going to happen one way or the other, and it's going to be written on a piece of paper that large majority of our community is not going to read anyway, let alone have an opinion on. That being said, I think what will determine whether we're growth hungry or growth happens is the levers we choose to pull, and so it's more in what we're choosing to do to enable stuff. And I'm right. We shouldn't be looking. Rogan's right. We shouldn't be looking to buy growth at the expense of our existing ratepayers.
I think it's actually pretty critical and important that we actually have if you like, a position or a strategy in terms of how we're going to manage that growth. Because if we don't, we'll see things like Tauranga happen to us, or other towns and villages around this country where they've been ad hoc and reactive to stuff that has gone on. There's no planned approach to managing what that growth is. We know that growth is coming. We know that we have to manage that and keep ahead of it. Because if we don't, we'll end up with I think a bit of a shambles in terms of not understanding where we're going and what we're doing in terms of where our district is going. It's almost a little bit of a mix between growth happens and growth hungry in terms of where I sit, because there is some things that we should be doing on that growth hungry side, and I agree with Rogan. I'm a bit bit wary about providing incentives, but I do believe that we sort of have to be proactive and enable opportunities to happen. But a lot of it is market driven, and a lot of it is things like that. I just also think in terms of that growth that we've got to be very conscious of employment opportunities, because I don't think if we haven't got the jobs here, then that's going to limit the amount of growth that we've got. So we've got to somehow inveigle into that growth approach some sort of recognition that jobs and employment opportunities and business opportunities actually create or motivate those people to actually want to come here in the first place.
Yeah, I just want to add, sorry, that thing on Bernie said, growth, the growth provides opportunities, we know that. Provides employment, we know that. And it's not about growth in terms of housing that we've seen in this community. In this district, it's business. And we're getting business that we never dreamed of getting 10 years ago. And just picking up on, I think, I just thought, from other council's point of view, growth has previously been canvassed with our community through other LTPs, and by and large the community support growth. growth. You're always going to get NIMBYism where we get in the beach communities. I want to live here, but I don't want anyone else to. So it's as long as we're going clearly on the LTP around our growth and whatnot, and the negatives and the positives, because there's both. But by and large, I think this council's previously identified that growth is by and large very positive, as long as Bernie said, it's dealt with in the right structured way. Otherwise, you end up being a terror. So yeah, I totally agree.
Question, and this is just about the population projection and choosing. According to the reports, we're doing a 20-year plan, but the population growth, they claim to be front-loading the first 10 years. Is that something we would... Oh, you're nodding. Okay. Is that our approach too?
It's certainly an approach we can take. That's what we took last time, was to split. We went to the 20-year plan. The previous LTP, we had a different rate for the first 10 years versus the second 10 years. In that case there, it stepped up in the second 10 years, but my head nod was to indicate that yes, you can have a different rate for a period of time within that. 10 years obviously is one way of doing it. You could do a 5 and 15 or a 15 and 5 or something, or vice versa.
I'm going to ask another question. In many ways, I agree with Clinton and Rogan as well. That will just happen. But isn't there a focus of ensuring growth where we get higher land values and higher capital values of houses and things like that? So we are extracting more rates out of that growth, isn't it? Or is that something we don't talk about?
There's that element. I guess I sit here and I listen to that, and my mind goes back to probably Blair's presentation a week or so ago about the housing action plan, where there's obviously some key drivers of what this council saying. Actually, we want affordable housing, and we need to be chasing. We need to be doing what we can as a council to make that happen in the district as well. So that, I don't think it's an either or. I think you can have both, but I'd be hesitant to just simply maybe chase what you've just described, or to say that's all we're about, when there's obviously other conversations that are actually saying this is really important, and actually we're tasking council, one of your priorities officers is to go off and basically deliver in that space and understand what affordable is and make opportunities for that.
But I think we have an obligation to make sure that we are generating income to provide the services we need for the people of the town, rather than providing for the lowest common denominator. You're right. It's going to be a very hard balancing act, providing some of the aspirations around affordable housing and making this a livable place. But then making this a livable place also comes at a cost, and there has to be that revenue generated somewhere in the community.
Don't disagree, but I'm grateful that it's this collective table making that decision. We're simply facilitating the conversation that's been requested to see, can this table lead it, or does the council see a place for having a view and an appetite or an approach to it towards growth that it's willing to sort of define or base its growth management approach around.
I personally see our district to be more growth hungry. I agree with Deputy Mayor. We have to get our workforce ready. It's definitely coming. Let's be proactive.
I'm just not sure where we are as a table. There's two who haven't spoken, I think, of whether they wish to have a view and whether we see where on balance we lie, where on the spectrum we lie, so we can give a message back to David and Karo on that.
I suppose the question, though, just checking in with David in terms of, is it either or is it leaning more towards growth hungry or leaning towards, as some have said, don't care? So in terms of, is that what you're looking for, David, a response in that space?
I guess I've sought to facilitate the conversation that Councillor Jennings wanted to have, which was that he thought it was important for this council to establish what its view was towards growth and where it was going to sit, and whether it was going to potentially look to target, growth as a particular target that we were sort of going to work towards, and that was what we were going to speak confidently about and be, I guess, trying to promote that confidence in investment decisions versus just sort of accepting that, this is where we think we'll be, but sort of more that acceptance that it will happen, and we haven't really sort of taken the same active approach towards it. I felt there was probably a little bit more energy in this conversation when he introduced it last week than maybe what I picked up through the email, so we'll find it a little bit hard to maybe do his comments justice here. But obviously we see growth as an important part. Well, at the moment we're going to be talking to the community about aspects relating to growth through this long-term plan, and so I think it is helpful to be able to articulate, and maybe in the form of a question around this is how we're sort of looking to approach or manage growth going forward, which I think can have aspects of, you've obviously picked up on different things across the spectrum that I've identified, things that you're comfortable with, things that you like to see more of. So it certainly doesn't have to only be that list or only be that list. It is basically what is this council's approach, which can be a myriad of all things essentially, but what is this council's approach going to be towards growth, which I think we're all in acceptance is going to happen, and then it comes down to how much do you sort of want to influence or shape or even potentially control that going forward. So probably you say I'm looking for a little bit more of a steer than I've got at the moment, and then obviously in the moment we're going to ask you a bit further in terms of projections and percentiles, and I guess that would be a good early test as to whether or not there is a disconnect as well, because I guess as I've listened to some of the conversations tonight, I've sensed potentially there could be some disconnect in other parts of conversations that we've had when it comes to whether it's district plan changes, housing action plan, possibly even our approach to maybe infrastructure provision things as well.
Do you want to touch on next week and how this might connect? Can you?
Yeah. So next week it's loose title at the moment. It's called Growth Coordination. That might have a fancier title on the presentation by next week. What I guess we've become aware of is that growth planning has provided some challenges for this council, and that at the moment the council's approach to growth has been almost to chase or enable growth in multiple locations. And so that starts to create challenges when people want to come and develop in those locations, and that we may not always have the infrastructure ready to enable that. And so then either we get seen as the handbrake that's slowing down development, or we're putting council in a situation where actually to enable that area to be serviced and for it to be developed, there's actually more widespread infrastructure implications, potentially plant treatment plant upgrades and so on, that we start to trigger because we're opening up sort of multiple areas. And so that probably a view that or some direction that was probably given to officers previous term was not to pick winners so much, was to more sort of have quite an open approach, and the market would sort of decide which ones went first, but to have lots of opportunity, and that was one way which we might be able to influence keeping the prices down. The conversation we'll bring to you next week will just paint some of that picture in terms of where we might, some of the capacity challenges and what that might mean if we were to sort of continue with the current approach. And I guess we'll be putting some questions to you, or getting some insights from you in terms of, is it appropriate for council maybe to change its approach a little bit and actually be a bit more focused in terms of we've enabled some growth and development opportunities, and to maybe continue to push those in a particular location, because we can service and provide for those, and maybe hold back other areas until we're in a place to do that. So it is tricky, and I guess we're bringing it to you at this stage while there's still hopefully time to make some decisions in that space, but because we think it's important for you to understand some of those challenges that we are facing.
that sounds like a much more interesting conversation to have. So that sounds better. I just got one last question. Do you want to go back to some of those numbers on the number of houses or something it was? That one, yeah. Is that really significant in terms of our district? I mean, in terms of a rating income or the amount of rates we collect from that, is that significant at all? So does it make any difference what percentile we read?
The short answer is yes. I think it is. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Because you're basing your rate income about how many dwelling units that you've got in the district. So.
Is 233 versus 312 any more significant than the other?
You're essentially talking a potential percent. So yeah, which is significant.
500 grand.
Like when you guys are debating a 5% increase versus a 6% rates increase, based on, we spent 4 hours to decrease 0.5%, it's significant. So I think it is important.
David, just a quick question in terms of, is it worth now doing those population stats and sort of giving you some direction on where we sit with the percentage, if you like, which may actually inform the growth approach? Because if it's picked at 50%, I think there'll be a different approach to what it is at 95. That there will be some things that you pull apart in terms of in a different direction. You'll treat it differently, and I just wonder whether it is worth coming back to that approach after we've sort of given you some direction in terms of where we sit in terms of that percentage growth. I don't know. Would that make it easier for the table? Or how far down the road do you want us to go tonight in terms of that? Is there going to be another opportunity for us to actually, now we've had this conversation, will there be a further opportunity to decide that, or do you need that direction now tonight?
I think, if possible, it would be great to get the projection percentiles and information provider agreed tonight for us to start working with, because there is some work within the business that hangs off that the team need to get on with. The statement around growth, yes, we can massage or work something up in time. Part of my reason for putting up those ones with the prizes was, I guess, to paint a bit of a picture that you can read those and actually you can sort of in your own mind almost make those about, you take away the place names and you can sort of make them about anywhere really. And I've deliberately picked a few of the fastest growing areas, and you still probably didn't pick up that strong sense that they were, it didn't come across saying that they were hungry. They used some other words, and the company one talked about, this wave of growth that, we sort of can't stop. We just have to make sure we plan for it well and things. So there's that aspect, which I think, it's right to have a statement, but I guess it's probably painting a bit of a picture that you could spend a lot of time trying to get quite articulate about it, and the reality is, I think you probably will end up with something that's somewhat generic anyway, and but it is important for the community to get that sense of, well, how are we looking to advance that. So the question that we were going to ask you is essentially which of the set of projections, which provider. So we've used Sense Partners for the last two. Do we stay with Sense Partners? Do we go with Infometrics? And the information sent out prior, Kiro tried to articulate some of the differences between the providers. And then which percentile? Do we continue with the 95th percentile or something different? So I'll go from there and I'll bounce back to that slide there, which is probably the most helpful one. We're sort of talking about, maybe if I could shorten the conversation, I'd suggest that we don't go with Stats NZ and we make a decision between Infometrics and Sense Partners. Well, we've paid for it now, so we've got the information. It's really about what we want to use and use to inform the Infometrics. They're very high. I think you read is the 95th percentile. The 75th would be what you read as as the high if you're looking to make comparisons. Mediums 50th. So we've probably started the bidding. Councillor Hoyle a moment ago indicated as 75th percentile. Did you have a provider that you were leaning towards with that?
I was sticking with the same. Yeah, since partners.
So open to other bids or other thoughts?
I'll go then. I agree actually with Rogan. I think 75 is, and Sense Partners, I think we need to be consistent. The fact that we've used them in the past, they've been reasonably accurate as well. But I do think we're putting too much pressure on the organisation if we think that 95 is, and I know the comment around underestimating against overestimating, but I think in the current climate for the next 3 years, because that's principally what we're talking about, I think 75 is where we should land.
Yeah, I'm not there with you at the moment, Bernie. But can we have a bit of what are the consequences of Lincoln or you, David? What's the consequences going from the 95th down to the 75th? I'm just wondering what message that sends, and what are the actual consequences of that in terms of financial assumptions and everything else, to development contributions, etc. So, because it's easy to say 95 to 75, what is the consequences of it?
I'll start, and if Jacinta then wants to talk about the financial side of it. Look, there is, I think what we're seeing already is obviously market or global forces. There is a bit of a reset. So from 2020, where we thought things were going to be, there has been an effect, and obviously things have been scaled back. So naturally, I think that's going to be reflected in the plans across the country. The implications of going with something less than 95th percentile, look, it could possibly influence some investment decisions, but again, I think the difference between being more conservative going 95th percentile down to 50th, a much bigger step. I think when we start to look at some of those number differences between there, again, that probably not so significant that some of those more significant, the bigger investment decisions that Kiwi Rails and Waka Kotahi's and things might make are probably going to be too detracted. What will potentially happen? And look, it's interesting. We have our growth projections, and we are possible, obviously, try and encourage others to use that when they are dealing with us. But every now and then you will meet a stubborn government agency that will stick to a set of projections that they have, which won't always necessarily reflect what's happening on the ground. And so sometimes that will obviously influence some of their decisions. Like I said last time, obviously further out, what potentially, so at the moment the plan will have had more significant growth planned on that higher 95th percentile from 2020, and so it will potentially be saying we're growing faster, and therefore we may need some infrastructure investment, for instance, earlier. Going to the 75th percentile would now say, well, actually we're going to be growing slower, might not get to there, so either that investment isn't needed as soon, probably based on next week's conversation, unlikely to say it won't be needed ever. It just means some of those things get pushed further out. So whilst we're doing an infrastructure strategy for 30 years, there could be the odd thing that was maybe some distance out, which might not actually feature in this time LTP if it was that far out. But I think 30 years you would expect to see those more significant infrastructure decisions still captured even at the 75th percentile. It's still suggesting somewhere between 47,000 and 53,000 if we take those ones down the bottom there, on the other page, in terms of people, but it's still, considering we're at 37,000 people at the moment, it's still quite a jump up for the district, so it is still going to drive, I think, investment and the need for it. Jacinta, did you want to add anything just around the financial implications going from 95th down to 75th?
Sure, I guess from our side it would be just development contributions would be in the short term, assuming we spent the same for growth but it was going to take longer, then we'd see debt higher in the short term because we hadn't received all that growth in terms of development contributions yet. And the average rates, assuming that we didn't change our spending needs in the operational space, would be higher for those existing residents because we wouldn't have the growth to help offset that.
I'll just throw my thing out there though. So I'll stick with the 95th, and obviously probably with Sense Partners just to have that consistency as well.
I think Jacinta answered a lot of my questions. Obviously Sense Partners seems to have the better data, but it seems like there's a reputational and an ongoing financial risk with dropping our percentile down to 75. That's what I understood from what Jacinta just said. If we're telling everyone that we're having slow growth, it's probably going to be a reality, and it may be even slower than what we actually project.
Happy to support 95 and Sense Partner.
I'm just imagining Sam wanting to throw a parachute in and jump out of a plane if he turns up to find we went back to 75%. I'm happy with 95. Sense Partner's fine.
To be clear, there's already a drastic reduction made in the 2023 figures instead of sticking with the 2022 figures, even if we stick with 95%. So there are the exact same financial implications that you were just told are still true even choosing 95%. In fact, the significance between the two is fucking, it's not. It's pennies. Look at 2029, it's 800 people.
But we are planning for a 20-year period though, so we have to look at that 20-year figure.
We're also reviewing it in 3 years, so
And I'm glad my strategy worked. That you justified your 95th percentile. That's important because you can't just automatically accept it. You've got to justify it. You've got to hear the other side of the argument. So good on you.
Sense and 95.
Sense and 95.
Lies, damned lies, and statistics. And I'll just go and get my crystal ball for the rest of it. 95 and Sense Partners. But the growth thing, change is inevitable. It's coming. So how we want to influence that. But I'm thinking for me, quality over quantity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I after hearing, like Jonathan said, Jacinta's few words at the back there, I also wondered, taking on Bernie's point about principally the first 3 years, which is beyond or round about when the new entity kicks in, and if we transfer, how do they use, I don't know if NTU are clear about it, but how do they use population? And if we says, well, there's a 3,000 person difference, like what's their investment? Like how are they, does that mean they'll do less? No, they'll stick to our plans that we pass over, but then if we reduced our capital works and as a result, I just want to know, sure.
At the moment, the NTU's kind of commitment has been to take on the asset management data and the infrastructure, like our inputs into the infrastructure strategy, which you recall was a lot of the reason why we did the LTPA. I don't think they're at this. Yeah, they're not even talking about population forecasts in communities yet.
Cool. Yeah, 95. sense.
What will happen is obviously our growth assumptions will inform things like our activity management plans, our infrastructure strategy, and the infrastructure strategy is obviously what's going to essentially be what the entity has to pick up and to understand our context and what's needed and what work is planned and why it's planned for when it is. So they will certainly be the message that's what 95th percentile means for us. Whether or not they adhere and take all that on board along with all the other councils that they adhere, that remains to be seen. But obviously the best thing we can do is make sure our story is the one that we want it to tell. Okay, well that was a bit easier than the growth appetite bit, so thank you, Bernie, for encouraging that. I don't know if we can, whether that gets us much further with the growth appetite conversation, so I'm going to...
It does, though, because it means that those growth approaches have to be more hungry if you're searching for the 95th percent, if you want 95th percentile. So it does inform that growth approach.
Totally agree, and that's where we'll be. When you sign up to $35 billion investment in a place called Tarahika, you're growth hungry. You've embraced it, you've accepted it, and it's on. So nothing's changed.
Okay, that's helpful. I think what we can probably do is look to shape, using some of the things from today's discussion, the things that you've sort of indicated as support for, in the way that you're leaning, and see if we can sort of capture that in a bit of a growth approach, and obviously find a way of circulating that back and getting some further feedback in time. But we'll keep moving with the presentation. Thank you. That's what you don't know is, or may not fully appreciate, is the population projections, and why we do that is probably one of the first significant forecasting assumptions that we talk about, is because it does feed down into so many parts of the LTP. So that is now going to be really gratefully received by a number of activity managers who will be starting to calculate the number of dogs and people and houses and so on, and how that impacts their work.
Thank you. And then we turn our mind to the question about whether Council is doing a 10 or 20 year LTP. So there was some earlier discussion about this, and where we got to was that kind of holding it a 20 year pending an answer about the implication for development contributions. So we have an answer for you about that. So looking at whether changing from a 20-year long-term plan to a 10-year long-term plan has any impact on the ability to charge and collect development contributions. Are there any other negative impacts? So last week there was a nationwide working group on development contributions held with people who work on this right across the country, all getting together. And we got some information from there. The general feeling and general advice was that it's not considered wise to pull back from a 20-year long-term plan to a 10-year long-term plan, because it means that future infrastructure can't be charged for in DCs. That the follow-on from that, as we've talked about in terms of growth, is that rates go up and future ratepayers are charged for growth infrastructure rather than that cost being captured through development contributions. So that could have a significant impact on the rates. Why that is because if projects are outside that 1 to 10 year period that the plan covers, it doesn't cover years 11 to 20, and so that if a project and growth is in that area, we can't collect that. It also means that if a project is brought forward and it's not in our development contribution policy, it's not in our plans, then we can't collect DCs for that either.
Just a query, Karen. So you're saying we collect DCs over a 20-year period currently. Is that what you mean? And so if we brought it back to a 10-year, 10 years of that would need to be refunded because we're not actually. I don't quite see the correlation, because what about all those districts that have already got 10-year plans, but they've all got development contributions? How do they get on for their infrastructure strategy in 30 years?
When that different part gets charged and collected.
So why would it mean their rates go up?
You know how when you issue a consent and then there's a stage in it that will go
So my understanding was that you need the two to line up, and so that if we are only considering a 10-year period, it isn't considering that later stage. I hope I've described that correctly. And it limits the projects that are set out in the policy so that the two do flow together, so that if one's 10 years, the other one was 10 years as well.
Yeah, so for example, Bernie, like if I go to the Central Hawke's Bay long-term plan, it's a 10-year plan, and so their development contributions policy only refers to projects within that 10-year period. So the projects only go to 2000. Well, these projects, they've only got the growth component of projects until 2031, and so it's that growth component of those projects to 2031 that they're distributing across the development contribution, versus in our case, because we've got a 20-year long-term plan, we've got the project needs across the 20-year period and are distributing it across DCs that way. So for example, hypothetically, 2034, we need to spend $10 million on a new aquatic centre. We're able to start collecting development contributions for the growth component of that aquatic centre now, because it's in the 20-year period, versus if it's in the 10-year period, we can only collect it for the 10. Yeah.
So following on from that, the question would be, would council like to do a 10 or 20-year LTP?
I'll withdraw my earlier objection to the 20 year and go for the 20 years. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, did I?
Yeah, I'd support the 20-year long-term plan as well.
Yeah, look, that's much clearer now in terms of the impacts that obviously 10-year. I still don't think in practical terms that 10 years is. I still think that 10 years is the right way to go, but obviously the impacts that it has are far greater than the ease and practicalities of it. So yeah, look, I'll change my mind as well and support a 20-year.
Hands up from me too. I was leaning 10, I'm now 20. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. We'll work on that basis, and that will help inform the budgets and activity management planning that officers are working on at the moment as well. Thank you. Then we come to SSPs. At the last workshop, we provided an Excel table that set out all of council's current SSPs. There were two parts to that. So the first page was all of them. The second page was the mandatory SSPs. And we asked if you were able to have a look through and identify whether there are any that you would like us to keep in mind as we are doing some additional work to propose different ways of looking at our SSPs, different examples and how we may do that. So I wondered whether you had any that you would like us to keep at the moment. I'll leave it there.
Did I potentially miss something at previous meetings where we decided that we should abolish all the non-mandatory SSPs? If so, can you fill me in real quick?
They're not being abolished, but taking a look at how we present them and taking a look at whether the SSPs that we are using at the moment are fit for purpose. Do they measure the right things? We're also looking at ways that other councils do them. Our council, we have 109 SSPs, and that's a lot. Most other councils have far fewer, and so we're looking at providing some examples of how they do it. And so we're not abolishing them all, but just asking if there's any in particular that you would like to have kept.
A smaller and hopefully more meaningful number of SSPs that show help us measure performance.
Cool, but we're still going to measure these performance measures because a lot of these are important, or we're proposing not to measure a bunch of them. So, yeah, I mean, I've gone through the list and I've put keep on a bunch of them. If we remove them from here, they're not going to be measured at all, or they're just not going to be measured through the SSP framework and some other manner.
It would be looking at what we're measuring, and are we measuring what we actually want to deliver? So are the SSPs telling us what we need to know?
Yeah, and I don't know the examples you've got there, but for instance, there'll be some where we have, for instance, X number of publications per year, and we've sort of said, well, does that actually tell us, the community, whether they're getting value for that service or not? That, if it was of interest to council, they could probably provide that in another report rather than that being an SSP. Let's have something which, for that activity, helps the community understand whether or not they're getting what value and benefit, I guess, they're getting for that service being provided by council, and how we're going against that.
Because, I think things like we comply with all our Lagoima requests within the time frame is an SSP worth keeping. I can't see why that shouldn't be kept.
So, did I get this right? So you're going to come back with another list, or after you've done some analysis of other councils, or what's the process going forward?
So what we're looking at doing is coming back with some examples of ways that other councils are doing it, and then proposals of ways that we could do ours differently. So yes.
So we should just wait for that, really, shouldn't we?
Yeah, but at our last two previous workshops, councillors asked us to circulate the SSPs in order for those that were more interested than others in the SSPs to kind of go through and in a granular detail say that makes no sense. That I think that's really important, because the intent would be that, like, I think we've already had the mandate from council that we need to shift our SSPs into far more meaningful descriptions so that we can measure the impact rather than it being about the output. And so we're going to go away and come up with some options around that, but this was just to get really early insight and direction from council around, well, what are you in love with and what do you hate? Oh, you go.
Would it be a more efficient process then for councillors individually just to email back that spreadsheet? Yeah. And then to collate that alongside. Yeah.
I also think
sorry.
I also think it's important though to have the conversation. I mean, sometimes email responses don't necessarily, unless everybody sees those responses. Yeah, I mean, look, I had one around with ST5 percentage of customers satisfied with the stormwater service. I mean, it's not mandatory. Where the one before it says the number of complaints received by council about the performance of the stormwater system expressed per 1,000 properties is mandatory. So why we would bother with having one that says the same thing, I don't know. So, you know, little things like that, you know, I think it's important that, you know, we've asked for it as well. So I think we should have a conversation. If there is no feedback, then fine. We proceed as David and Horowhenua did.
Oh, I thought you might want to respond to the approach, because I might ask for something and you've already kind of.
Oh, look, I think there can be some efficiencies in terms of maybe the helpful thing is if people have got their lists already and they can email those through. When we provide something back, that can obviously signal that this has been suggested for inclusion by ex-councillor, and then we can obviously have that probably rounded conversation that with the good examples or the good practice examples that we're putting forward as well. I guess part of the reason for trying to understand those ones that you saw the benefit in keeping and ones that you didn't, that can help us with our focus as well in terms of where we're applying our energy and effort in looking at these. I think there I've just tried to please two parts to it. One in terms of the efficiency, but also one valuing the conversation that had. But I think the two can work. If you have been through that process, those of you who wanted to and can provide that to us, then we can build that into what comes next.
I like the efficient approach in the email, but it is good to hear what others think about targets sometimes. For example, I'm not saying what I'm about to say is what I think, this is an example. So for, where does it say, Horowhenua is fully accessible to all people, and then in the next column it says that we hold so many meetings per year in the Access and Inclusion Committee, and it says more than 4 meetings a year, and I'm like, what does that mean? How does that make Horowhenua more accessible? In reality, shouldn't we, because that's the target and the only target, and then if I think back to the last presentation around Sport Manawatu and they say, oh, you've got 43 parks and reserves, well, I'd like to know, well, how many of those are actually accessible? Do we provide I actually don't know the answer. Do we have that in our stock take that this many of, 20 of them have the ramps and this and that, and some of them have the right toilets, some don't? That's kind of, for me, how I can determine whether we're doing what that first statement says or not. And I don't know, so if it's a target, it's got to be meaningful, but at the same time, where it lands is up to the table, not just a councillor who's involved in that space.
No, so it would certainly seem that the council helping set those targets. So I guess at this stage we're checking what measures you've either like or dislike, and we continue with or discontinue. And then there's clearly a process of, okay, well, this is the measure we're going to use. What's the appropriate target for the non-mandatory ones where we get to set targets, and that has to be a around the table conversation. I think it's best done face to face as opposed to trying to do that via email.
So for me, David, there's a whole lot here I can see it going. I just don't see there's any need for them. But I guess if I use one as an example, it's in the regulatory services, and it says all reported cases of illegal building work will be responded to within 5 working days. Very good, but I don't need to know that, I don't think, but personally. But where would outside the SSP that comes to us, where would that be recorded within the organisation in terms of a performance measure inside the organisation? Yeah, probably what I'd want to know as elected member is that we're complying with the legislation about the stuff we have to do, including these things here, perhaps. But yeah, does that make sense?
And look, we haven't. I don't think we've designed that alternative approach for where we might carve some of these out. But you receive an organisation report, for instance, which reports on a range of things, and there might be certain things that through this SSP process you say actually doesn't need to necessarily be an SSP, but we are interested in wanting to know that's still being done or on track or how you're tracking, and that could be something which can maybe be carved out and then put in that report, for instance, which you obviously get to see and then talk to as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote keep on a lot of these, but I'd have no issue with them being moved to the organisational performance report and not being a SSP. I'm still confused as to, yeah. I'd like a lot of these to be better, sure, but getting rid of councillors being told if we just stop responding to building complaints and we just, they take 20 days to respond and now we don't need our SSP. Oh, the SSP's gone, that's fine. Yeah, these were put here for a reason. I love ripping shit out, but I kind of need some more context before I fully commit to this.
And I think hold that thought, because when we do come back with some what I'll call best practice, some good examples from other places, then you might say, okay, well, that's a way in which another council actually been able to measure that same thing, but provide it in a more meaningful way, or a way which is actually giving a better sense of, like to use the example that Peter used just before, in terms of a target of having 4 meetings. That doesn't require them to be good meetings. That could be 4 rubbish meetings. Does it actually give the sense that that's a good delivery of that service, for instance? And so hopefully there'll be some examples we can show where actually, that does give me a better sense that that's a service that's being well delivered. Right, so if I was to try and wrap this part of the conversation up, it would be that if people have done that work and put some thought into it, or have even been sparked to put some thought into it on the back of this conversation, can we feed that through to us, and then we'll look to incorporate that with the good practice examples and things that we'll be sort of sharing with you and looking at our approach for going forward. The next topic we just wanted to talk about was fees and charges. So this is not the discussion associated with revenue financing policy where we talk about the funding splits, the exacerbated beneficiary part of it. That will come later. This is because this week we opened up the budget process for our staff and our officers to go away and start to do their activity management plans, confirming their work programs, and starting to put their budgets along, their zero-based budgets alongside this work to inform the LTP. So as part of that, obviously we've got some officers, we're all set to go off and make some budget assumptions around income, for instance, based on fees and charges. I do need to stress, there are a couple of fees and charges that we do have to consult on if we're proposing changes. So those are in the resource management planning space and our Food Act fees. But essentially all other fees and charges council gets to set and then we adopt just ahead of the new financial year. Usually we do it at the same time as we adopt the LTP or the annual plan. And in the past you've given some direction on this, and rather than coming late in the piece after we've already done a whole lot of work, we wanted to come quite early in the piece now, just as people are starting to think about their budgets, and test, I guess, what direction or appetite you have. There has been, go back to 2020, there was a fee freeze. We basically said no, we're not having any increase. More recently, we have looked to reflect inflation, and so that has varied. 2 years ago, I think 2022, it sort of sat around 2%, I think we increased them. The last year just been, the average was around about 5%. There were a few sort of ones that were changed to reflect actual costs and things. And so it would be really helpful to get that sense of, does council have an appetite in terms of any changes to fees and charges that you can give us as a high level, just to help inform that budget discussion. Obviously, as we do that and bring this back alongside the revenue financing policy, then that's where we'll be looking at some of those cost to serve of those activities and understanding, well, if we went with the fee structure proposed, will that actually mean we're inside or outside those splits? And if so, do you want to change the fees and charges, or do you want to change the splits and manage that? So if you can accept that conversation will come a bit later, so it might mean we end up targeting a few areas in particular. But in terms of a high level direction, if we said fees and charges, are you open to those being increased? And I'll start by just going at the level of inflation, or is there another approach that you want to send as your direction to budget holders?
May I just mention that if you have an appetite not to increase fees, then by default you're saying it should be funded by rates instead, because we will have cost increases as part of the zero-based budget, and if they're not funded by the same increase in fees, then effectively you're making the decision that you prefer they be rates funded.
I'll just jump in there. I think with any business in today's climate, you would be expecting some increase in costs. Doesn't matter what you do with it, fuel, cost of capital, etc. For me here, I think we sort of need to increase the fees to probably echo that. But I would be mindful. I'd probably prefer use a pays rather than put it a blanket across all rates, because I don't see that as necessarily being fair, especially if it's a targeted sort of aspect of being a fee. So for me, I would probably see an increase in fees for the likes of these things.
Just trying to understand what are the fees and charges you're talking about there, right across the board, everything. So the conversation around the public-private split and public, we talk 80-20 and 90-10 and all those sorts of things. Does that conversation have to happen as well? Sorry, I've got to just go.
So, Jacinta,
So generally when we set the budget, we'll be setting it this year based on zero-based budget, so that we're building up what does it cost to run each activity. And then we will be, generally when we set the budget, we assume that cost increase that's part of running that activity, if it's a 5% increase in the cost for running that activity, then we will assume that same 5% increase in fees, so that everything is consistent and any split that has been agreed is carried on. As part of the early budgeting process, sort of around November, as part of your first initial review of what the budgets look like, we will be presenting to you that view of what does the funding split look like based on the budgets that have been set. And also as part of that, what are the proposed fee increases based on the fees and charges schedule, because those, you need to know what the proposed fees are based on the fees and charges schedule, what that means in terms of the public-private split, and then also the overall revenue and expenditure. As part of leading up to this plan, though, is areas where, for example, we reviewed some of the regulatory activity last year, is getting that early signal if there are particular areas where you'd like additional focus as part of us preparing the budget, so that we can come back with some different options in terms of the split. So possibly one of the sessions that's coming up soon, we should probably present to you what those splits are again, so that you can highlight to us if there are areas where you'd particularly like us to focus some changes in terms of the revenue financing. Some for us might be trade waste was one that got flagged because the split looks a little bit different. The regulatory area might be one as well, as we work through the zero base, and particularly around some of the volumes changing if they need to, given the market conditions. Those are probably two that I'd flag at this stage.
Like the thing with the LTP is there's a certain sequence that we'll have to go through around particularly given the drive around the zero-based budgeting process, the revenue of financing public-private splits, and so some of these conversations will kind of come when you've seen the budgets. But I think what David is seeking from you is just a little bit of a signal, like what's off limits or what's at this this early stage, do you have any kind of complete allergic reaction that you want to give to us so that we're guiding our teams or preparing?
No, because my question was exactly what Jacinta was just addressed, so I'm happy. So no, I don't.
I have a question. It might be for the next LTP though, and potentially I might not be here, but I'll say it anyway. Exploring car parking fees, particularly in the mall where it's currently free, but for the specific purpose of funding the improvement and development of the town centre. So it's for that, and it's not like we're just trying to rake in some money, but it has an intent and a purpose, because if there's no other revenue generated for that activity, it's all just loan funded. And then how do you pay that loan back? It's either you sell something else or you maybe do something different and start to charge for the car parking. But yeah, same as Paul, user pays rather than applied to rates.
So I think just around parking, we feel like we got quite clear direction from elected members at the last two workshops about that being a priority between now and Christmas, around mechanisms in the LTP, whether that be rating or whether that be fees and charges, and how we might attract revenue to help fund some of that work. But I think as part of that, like, I know that Brent and I have commenced conversations about our fee structure for parking currently, and and you're not telling us that's off limits. So, as part of the activity management plan, we will have officers be presenting some of those things.
Thank you. So now we come to just looking ahead. Thank you for your direction this evening. Next week, we will be looking at levels of service and talking about early engagement. What would you like to engage on and the ways that you would like to do it? So start that conversation. We'll take the steer that you've given us today to help inform our budgets and activity management plans. We also wanted to share a bit more about what you can expect over the next few months.
But there, I wonder whether, just off the back of the conversation we've had around SSPs, whether we ask elected members, obviously some have already done the work, but for those that are interested, to get their SSP review to us by the end of next Monday, and then we could also capture some of the further progress the SSP conversation next Wednesday, because that feels really interconnected to the level of service. But
thank you.
Us to that by the end of next Monday. Cool.
Thank you. Great. So looking ahead to the rest of September, these are the headline areas that we will be coming to talk to you about. So further discussions on more of the forecasting assumptions, to have the levels of service discussion, early engagement topics, and come back to you on the SSPs, those three next week. Revenue and financing policy review areas, coming to talk to you and seek your direction on the development contributions policy review, and the same for the significance and engagement policy review. What should we be focusing on there as we work through? In October, coming back to you with some of those best practice examples of SSPs, early engagement, penciled that in for October. there'd be a post-election check-in, so about mid-October. What does the situation look like, and what, if any, implications are there for our long-term plan? And coming to you with a council report to confirm the guidance that we've had from you so far. November, rounding out significant forecasting assumptions, following up on SSPs and following on from the best practice, where should we be headed? Starting those budget conversations with you with the draft budgets, and that would also include the points that Jacinta's just mentioned about the split, the proposed fees and charges schedule, showing the public-private split. Coming to you to discuss infrastructure and financial strategies and start discussions about consultation document topics. In December, all of this is building towards aiming to be able to confirm budgets and confirm the directions for the draft LTP and consultation documents. So while this is the outline, it doesn't preclude any deeper dives into topics as you wish to, but this is kind of what we're working towards at the moment.
I suppose just checking in that we can handle this amount on a Wednesday, or are you looking to add other days in terms of that? Just so councillors are aware of the need to commit to other possible days that might be needed.
We're working to make sure that we can fit them in the Wednesday slots that we've got with you. Some might be longer than others, but if there was a change to that.
It might depend if you only want to focus on the LTP between now and Christmas. There's certainly other work. I'm really conscious, selfishly, of a couple of the timeframes you've set in the KPIs around implementation plans for Town Centre for Blueprint by 30th November, which, yep, I could go off and do in isolation, but I think better practice would be that we actually have some sessions with you on particularly the Town Centre. There's topics we want to bring back when we've done that extra work, extra investigation, and we want to be able to have that conversation with you to shape and inform that. So I'm only one of others that have a long list of things that we want time with you on, and so I think, yes, you can certainly expect probably every Wednesday and probably for a similar amount of time as tonight, where we're trying to bite off what's a manageable piece that allows the project to keep moving. But there's also some other pretty important topics that we're trying to make good progress on too, which might find us needing time outside Wednesdays.
Monique, I know, we've talked about, work program up until December. I mean, in light of what David said, I think it's probably, the other topics are going to inform that as much as this LTP process is, but I think it would be helpful if councillors knew what their commitment's likely to be, or potentially likely to be, between now and Christmas.
Yeah, and just reminding councillors that when they go onto the councillor portal, they can click onto the meeting tracker sheet so that they can see between now and Christmas kind of what's been logged. But I know that Grayson is doing a big push inside the business at the moment so that we're detailing that down to quite a micro level. But yeah, we're talking every Wednesday, and look, there might be the odd Thursday evening that we need from elected members as well. We're also obviously, we trialled it with the compliance strategy where we did the video instead and circulated that, and I don't know, we'll see come the October council meeting whether that was effective or not. We're about to do another one around the sensitive expenditure policy, so we're trying to, where possible, not use it for a workshop and try and use the electronics to work in our favour.
Yeah, and I think compliments to Vi on that video. It was a great, easy way to explain what she was trying to get across as well. And 7 minutes, which I thought was a great target that everyone else should aspire to